Anyway, so last week we talked about the family of grace. We talked about there were three parts, three aspects of being in the family of grace. The first one was hope. And we read in verse 24 of Romans chapter 8, it says, "For in this hope we're saved, but hope that is seen is not hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently." We talked a little bit last week. We're going to spend a significant chunk of time on hope this summer. So I didn't want to spend tons and tons of time, but hopefully last week we all got the gist of what real hope is in Christ. The second thing we talked about is intercession. And in verse 26 of the same chapter, it says, "In the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We don't know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God." So we talked about intercession last week. We talked about how when you intercede for somebody, it is a form of loving someone. That if you want to pray for somebody in a way that shows you love them, intercede for them. Don't just pray that God gives them all the cash they need or, whatever. But actually intercede. Put yourself in place of them in prayer. We talked about that last week. And then finally we talked about how in the family of grace there is shelter. And it says, "What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us?" We talked about what the real promise there is. That it's not some promise that means that suddenly spiritually you can lead single trials in a single bound and those kinds of things. That really what that is it's talking about how in verse 1 of the same chapter it says there is no condemnation. So whatever God has done for you, justified you, given you grace, given you favor, given you salvation, no man can take away. No one can stand in opposition of your salvation. No one can stand in opposition of what God has done for you. And so we talked at length about that part last week, and being careful what promises we apply to ourselves, right? Bible's got tons of them, and way too often we're applying the ones that have nothing to do with us. And we're applying them in this case improperly very regularly. So we thought about some few questions moving into why do a resurrection series. It was kind of a big one, because for most of us, resurrection is sort of a one-day thing, right? Yeah? No? Come on, really? Yeah. You guys are killing me. You guys spend a lot of time talking about resurrection in your daily lives? Yeah? You're like, only with the plants that are in the water. Right? Come back plant. Especially if you spend good money on artichokes. Not that I've ever done that. Talk about how important is the resurrection to my personal faith? Where does resurrection fit in with personal faith? And finally, can I be a Christian and enjoy the teachings, but dispute the facts of the resurrection? Right? Because we're kind of a piecemeal society. Yeah? We take a little here, we take a little there, make a little amalgam. That's what we want. Amalgam's a good word, right? The first time I heard that was in Australia back in 97. Different story. But amalgam is like where you just take a bunch of different things and make something, right? Just a, veritable plethora of ingredients to get an amalgam. And so, in this case, a lot of times our Christianity is kind of an amalgam, right? We take little things that we like and little things maybe we disagree with, we just take those out. We don't like to talk about, the doomsday stuff, so we're going to go ahead and take hell away. That makes Christianity way better, right? Just take hell away, and then we're going to take away, like, sin. We're going to get rid of sin. We're just going to pretend it doesn't exist, right? We're going to take grace, a lot of that, like a big boulder of grace, mercy, provision. Provision's a good one, right? You like provision? No? You guys hate provision? You guys are like, no, I hate having stuff. I'm so burdened by my stuff. Only if you still don't want it. So anyway, so a lot of times we have to be careful, because many times we have people sitting in our churches that really do that. They may not come out and say it, like they may go to a small group in a Bible study, they may go to their trek group and act like they don't say that, or don't believe that, but deep down inside, there are things that we tend to, I don't know if I really buy into that. Well, you can't do that. You can't have both of those things going on at once. And Christian's kind of an all in or all out type thing. And so you have to understand. So that's why we're talking about this. So this week we're starting a 5-week series on the resurrection. We're going to be focusing on the event details a little bit. Okay, so the actual resurrection of Christ details only a little bit. We're not going to spend tons of time on that, because we're going to be talking about the meaning of the event and how it dramatically impacts our spiritual lives. All right, so if you're really hoping for every week we're just going to raise Jesus out of the tomb, and do have a little human video, that'd be cool. Something like that, he's alive, something like that. Anyway, but I'm sure most of you are a little bit like me in the fact that you're used to hearing the resurrection talked about once, tops twice a year. at least in its details. So this is going to be a little different. But Paul dedicates a significant amount of time and a significant amount of papyrus to proclaiming the importance of the resurrection and the risen Christ. Papyrus. It was good stuff back then. And very green. Did not have a large carbon footprint. But it's important for all of us who claim the power of Christ in our lives to understand the value of the earthly resurrection. Not just talking about his death and his spiritual ascension. Now, please understand there is a huge difference between when Jesus ascends into heaven and the concept of the earthly resurrection. Okay, a lot of people will have no problem because most of us have this belief, right? You're going to pass away and then your soul is going to do that thing that it does in the movies and rise up. Okay, that is not the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus had a physical, earthly resurrection. So it's important that we understand the two differences. So over the course of this series, we're working our way through a single chapter in 1 Corinthians. Did you guys know that there's a whole chapter of the Bible dedicated just to the resurrection? Did you guys know that? And it's not in one of the Gospels? No? It's okay for you to admit no. It's fine. There are whole chapters in the Bible and things that I'm like, wow, I had no idea we really focused that much on it. But anyway, so that's what we're going to deal. So you are encouraged to read ahead. Please feel the freedom to read ahead. This is not one of those things where like, oh, I can't wait. I can't move on to verse 10 because I'm excited about what he's going to do for the next week and I don't want to read ahead. Go ahead. By all means, read it over and over again. That would be great. And so today we're going to start with chapter 15, starting at verses 1 and 2 is where we're going to start. This passage comes after Paul's stern recommendations and rebukes concerning public worship services. All right, this is important for how we look at the resurrection as understanding what happened in chapter 14. The church in Corinth was struggling with how and when the gift of tongues should be practiced in public services. Also, one of their great struggles was the ranking of the gifts based on importance. If you read further back in Corinthians, they're dealing with what gift matters more, what gift matters less, and all of that was going on. And some even elevating the gift of tongues to epic proportions, right? Like that was the top of spirituality. So the apostle takes his time and works through the practical application of the gifts in public worship. In case you want to know how a public worship service should look in church, it actually is in the Bible, which is very cool. Because I've heard people say, well, church isn't even really a Christian thing anyway, going to Sundays. Actually it is, and it's in there quite a bit. So he talks through it in chapter 14 about the gifts in public worship and how they should be exercised. And chapter 14 is also the chapter where Paul happens to be very specific about the women being silent in church. It's in there, just so you know. And I've heard it taught that it was because women sat on the outside, right? You've heard that one? Women sat on the outside of the church, the men gathered closest to the teacher, and the women in the middle of the service would yell out to their husbands, explain it to me, right? I've heard sermons done that way. I've heard it said that it's because women are inferior in their biblical understanding. Heard that taught, mostly in the South. And finally, I've heard it taught that women are not called to lead. I've heard that taught a lot. Specifically when a man doesn't want to be led by a woman. Hey, wait, it's the best time for this, we'll have it out. So the facts are that we know about the situation because of its context. And that's what's important, is that the church in Corinth was in complete and utter chaos. All right? It is important that we understand that when we come to this chapter on resurrection, that Paul is dealing with a church in complete and utter chaos. They had the spiritual gifts being practiced with a lack of control. The women were being catty and constantly chatting and talking it up and creating more problems. And many people were proclaiming that certain gifts were theirs when truthfully they were not their gifts to claim. Facts are it was completely out of control. And sadly not unlike a lot of churches today. Paul ends with one of the great rebukes of all time. When he says, let all things be done decently and in order. That's the way he ends it. He corrects them in love. If you read Corinthians carefully, there is some serious frustration with Paul dealing with how they're practicing. And he ends it, he says, let all things be done decently and in order. So then we roll into chapter 15. So you have to understand what's went on in 14. So it says, now brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. Now some of your Bible in your translations may actually have the word moreover there instead of now. Basically it's a lot like the word therefore, whereas it's dealing with a transitional thought being penned by Paul. He has spent ample time on dealing with things that are not salvation relevant. And he is going to bring it back to what really matters now. The goal of our foundation series is to do much the same. We're trying to move away from the how-tos and the 5 steps to the why, to the understanding. There's nothing more how-to oriented in the history of church sermons and teachings than how we're called to worship God in our public services. That is the ultimate in the how-to sermon, right? That in our church we look like. That is the ultimate in how-to and has nothing to do with the core values of why we're here. So, Paul wants to bring them back to the point of it all. He's saying, okay everyone, now that we've talked at length about all the physical practices of faith, let's go back and do a refresher on the reasons of faith to begin with. And he reminds them that they are saved by this gospel. They're saved from their sin and an eternity ostracized from Christ only through this gospel. They're not saved by how spiritually they practice their Sunday mornings, but rather how steadfastly they hold to the gospel that he preached to them. The church at Corinth was experiencing a bad case of the shanks, right? How many of you guys have ever seen that movie, Tin Cup? Right? Tin Cup is a great movie-ish, depending on your personal vows, you know, certain things in film. The interesting thing is he's this guy with a sort of natural gift for golf. It just comes smoothly to him, naturally to him. But then suddenly things start going on in his life where he becomes a little bit too involved in the thinking process of his golf swing. And all of a sudden he starts to get what's called the shanks. And he can't hit the ball correctly. And then what happens when he can't hit the ball correctly is he tries to get back to thinking through every point of everything that's going on, and so it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, to the point where now he can't even hit the ball with any quality because he's thinking it through too much. Well, here in Corinth, the church is worrying about all of this stuff instead of embracing the whole reason that they're there. Instead of embracing the great part, the centerpiece of faith, they are focusing on every little thing along the way, and it's creating all this difficulty. They're bickering and fighting over everything when it came to the practice of their faith, and while the whole time they were doing that, they were forgetting about the heart of their worship. So they were majoring in the minors, so to speak. And so Paul gently reminds them back. He reminds them in no uncertain terms that the gospel has saved them. And if they're holding to the true gospel that he preached to them, they can relax in that salvation. They know that they have not believed in vain. And all that other stuff, Paul says, is going to lead you astray. All that other stuff is going to cause for you conflict and worry and issues that are irrelevant to salvation. So being caught up in the functionality of your faith, rather than the heart of your faith, leads to destruction. Paul says if your faith is caught up in anything but the true heart of the gospel message, what you were saved to, then you have believed in vain. And it doesn't matter how passionate you are about practicing that functionality if you're missing the heart. This is what Corinth was doing. They were focusing on things that were added to and not what he preached in the core values. Ranking gifts, elevating gifts, turning away seekers because of your outlandishness is one of the issues he deals with. Is when you're doing what you're doing, people are walking into your church going, what in the world is going on here? And they're being turned away. And he deals with the women running amok and talking it up, and probably tons of rumors and issues going on, all these things. And he says, listen, let's get back to the point at the beginning. Let's get back to decency. Let's get back to order and focus on what matters. Because all of that bickering you're doing, all those things you're working through, isn't going to profit you anything. Just recall the purity of the original message is what he's saying. So he's crying out for them to recall what brought them into the house of worship to begin with. All of that outlandishness, all of those issues, all of that ranking and elevating of the gifts is not what brought anybody into the church. Nobody was standing outside of a church one day and went, man, that sounds totally chaotic, stupid, and political, and everybody's fighting. I want to go in there. No, that's not what brought them in. What brought them in is the heart of the gospel. And so his message here is to preach Christ and nothing else. And this is not something that the modern church has exactly eliminated, right? We haven't really eliminated this value. We have churches that say if you don't do it our way, you're risking your salvation. We have people looking down on those with slightly less spiritual gifting. We have churches calling out sinners and alienating them before they even meet them. We have churches that are elevating gifts over gospel. We say the gifts matter more than the gospel. We have churches that do that today. We're just like Corinth. This is not as uncommon as we want to believe it is. We have churches focusing more on social networking than spiritual connection. We have churches more concerned with their catchphrase than catching men. And we're out of control, but in America we do it in a very orderly way. We're doing the same thing as Corinth, just with order. So why do we preach grace so much here? I've been asked that question a lot in the last couple of weeks. Because it matters to what you were saved. I've been taught in my life that what you're saved with is what you're saved to. So if you're saved with a message of grace, then you're saved to grace. If you're saved with lights and glitz and rock and roll music and you know, insane quality, over-the-top stuff, then the reality is that's what you're saved to. And when that stuff goes away, you're going to have a problem. And so you have to be careful what you're saved with. That's why it's so important that we understand in this church that you're saved by grace through faith and not by works. Now you can abuse grace without caution. You certainly can. But then you have to ask yourself, were you ever saved to a complete gospel? Were you ever saved to a complete understanding? Or were you just listening to the part your ears wanted you to hear? That's the message that we work through in this church when it comes to grace. You can't be saved in the appealing functionality of the church. In other words, you aren't saved because the church gives you a place to have a lot of good friends and to have good social groups and to have good meals and to sit around and have chums and you know whatever. That's not what you're saved to. Then all it is, and the church is just a great place to come hang out, right? Now you're not saved to anything at that point. All you're doing is picking to do that on a Sunday morning instead of sitting around at your house by yourself. That has nothing to do with salvation. So you cannot be saved in the appealing functionality of church, but only through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So in verse 3 it says, "For what I have received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sin according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas first," that's Peter, "and to the 12. And after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and the sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. And last of all, he also appeared to me as one abnormally born." All right? So Paul labels this message of first importance. You understand that? Of first importance. He doesn't label anything about quality of public service, right? He doesn't, none of that is of first importance. When you're worried about whether or not you felt Jesus in the service, you're missing the point. Of first importance. This is where it all begins. Grace, love, hope, faith, everything has its miraculous origin in one person, Jesus Christ. The specific passage right here is called the First Church Creed. Okay? We don't have enough creeds anymore. Don't bring up the one that we wish we didn't have. We don't have enough creeds, right? The thing is we just don't have enough of them. Our creed's a good way of saying, like, like it's our motto. We hold true to it. It's a good thing, a creed, right? That's a great way. We need a family creed, right? We need these things. Creeds just sound intense, with purpose, with desire. And so this was memorized as it contained the utmost information for the believer to be able to recall in a single instant. It was the bedrock for the New Testament church, right here. This is what they memorized. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and he was buried, and he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. Of first importance is that creed right there. Of first importance, this is what we teach. Of first importance, this is what we believe in its entirety. Now, there is nothing theological about this. But it's interesting how much time Paul spends explaining the events around the resurrection, right? When he talks through the creed, as opposed to the life and death of Jesus. And so I have no doubt that someone has written a book on this passage and those events, but I still really don't have the time to go find it on Amazon. That's money, but you really need to look that through. Gabe has too much time. I'll give you guys a second. You should really look at that. That's totally worth every moment right there. And if I don't give it, it's just due. Justina wrote it. Steve Walker authored the book, Why Paul Spends So Much Time on Explaining the Resurrection as Opposed to the Life and Death of Jesus in Corinthians 15. Even has a price for it. Wow.
Is it Frank?
Huh?
Yeah, Frank.
Yeah. Man. Sorry. We just need to take a minute to look at that. But anyway, but after proclaiming the resurrection, then proceeds to list all of those who encountered Jesus in earthly form, which is really important. So according to the Creed, there are 3 steps of what Christ did. First of all, Christ died for our sins. In that death, we find forgiveness, we find grace, we find justification, we find all the things necessary as one gave the sacrifice in the place of another. We find what's called, in big church world, substitutionary atonement. Okay? It's a great thing, good t-shirt. Substitutionary atonement, which means somebody else stood in our place to give us the covering we needed. Second thing was, he was dead beyond doubt. Right? He was dead beyond doubt. Now, I think it's more important to stress this portion than probably what most people would think. The insurmountable nature of his death is without question. According to the crucifixion, when the spear was thrust into his side, the water and the blood separated, which meant that Jesus drowned in his own fluids. His breath was gone, his life was completely taken. His followers buried him in a tomb and sealed it with a mighty rock. Right? Now, this part, I think, signifies greater interest and depth also than what most people would give it. His followers sealed him up. Right? They put him in the tomb. They closed the door. This is where they buried him. They wrapped him. They did the whole thing, right? They understood they were done. They were moving on. If his followers were trying to deceive or, to hurry him away while he was still alive, it would have been a different story. But the reality is they played it first. And Rome came in and did their thing. But the reality is they closed the door. Jesus was dead beyond death. It was gone. And they put him in the tomb. But what's interesting is you have one of 2 choices. Either A, his followers all of those years didn't get it. Or B, they didn't listen. Because they buried him. They said their goodbyes. They were figuring out how to go to the next level. They were figuring out what to do next. And so we have that. In fact, that he was dead beyond doubt. He was buried. And then finally, he conquered death through the cunning use of death. He chose death as a way to conquer death, which doesn't make a ton of sense to people who can't overcome death by our very nature. The last stronghold of sinful consequence was removed when he rose from the dead. When we withhold our belief in the resurrection, we're proclaiming with a loud voice that death is more powerful than Christ. The power and the message of Christ is in his life, present tense, not in his death, past tense. Jesus does not continue to die every day for us. It was a one-shot deal, done, boom, but he continues to live for us. When we don't hold fast to the resurrection, we lose out on the true changing force of Jesus Christ. We miss out on the transformative power of the living Christ when we follow him as though we're following a dead teacher. When we seek to understand someone like Confucius, for example, we hold to the truth of his teachings, we listen to them, we follow his words and apply them to our lives. And we seek to understand him through what he taught. This is not how it is with Christ. The only way to truly understand his teachings is to understand and know him. You cannot have a relationship with a dead man, only someone living. So it is our proximity to the living Christ that brings to life his transformative message. There's someone to hold on to with Jesus, not just some wisdom to apply. There's a difference there. The resurrection brings the most transforming force into any situation, the living and breathing Jesus. It is transformative, and Scripture proves that to us. Paul goes on to list all of the people that encountered Christ that day, from Peter all the way to Paul. And then Christ appeared to Paul in so late a date that Paul says, I was like someone abnormally born. Which means my mom carried me a long extra time in the womb. Right? Which might be a little more personal. basically what it was Paul was overdue, way past his due date, is what he's saying. I was abnormally born. It took Jesus a long time to get around to birthing me. And for every one of those who had buried him, released him, said their goodbyes to him, the transformation came when they encountered him physically. Their encounter with the living Jesus brought to life their dead spirits, the people who had said their goodbyes, the people who had mourned his loss, the people who had begun to go into the process of preparing the body for the long-term stay in the tomb. They had given up hope, and now hope was suddenly returned to them in an instant. The resurrection is the only thing that makes that kind of transformation possible in those moments. Anybody who's ever been around someone mourning, what words help? Nothing. They help you, right? Especially when you feel like you got some good ones, right? You always feel like awful when you have the wrong words. But when you have the right words, you go home feeling good. It doesn't make them feel any better. The reality is, what changes, though, if that person walks in the room? Doesn't that change everything? If they're mourning a loss, and all of a sudden the reason they're mourning their loss shows up, it changes everything. The reality is that's the only thing that could have mattered was earthly resurrection. Nothing mankind can create, no atmosphere, no slogan, no network, no building can ever imitate the true impact of the living Jesus on the most dreadful heathen. Major props for using both of those words, connected. It was present. He said the fourth scroll, I'll be back in. Try as we may, we cannot manufacture it with lights and music, for only a manipulated emotion or two is the fruit of that endeavor. Now, you can have your emotions manipulated in environments done well, right? I've shared with everybody this before, but people say music has no impact on my life. The music I listen to has no impact on my life. I just like it. And Cambridge University did a study on the movie Psycho. And I assume none of you have seen it because it's rated all right. But in the movie Psycho, they had 100 students watch it and describe their emotions, right? And their emotions were terror, fear, anxiety, anxiousness, all the things. Everybody's seen Psycho. It's filled with those emotions, right? I mean, that's what the movie's built to do. And then they took the music out. And then they played the movie. And it was stupid, lame, dumb, boring, dull, couldn't care less, fell asleep. How is it the same visual image? Because you can manipulate emotions. Music manipulates emotions, right? You can manipulate anything you want. In the 80s, man, we loved to play the piano in worship. Because there was something about that, the high end on the piano. Just one hand, you don't even need both. And you could be stone cold, tough guy in the back, nothing going on, slept through a whole sermon. And then the pastor goes, now, that's the pianist, come back up. And they start playing, and dude, you melt, bro, you're broken. Jesus, I don't know what happened. I'm a sinner saved by grace. You can't get to the altar fast enough. Why? Because it manipulates your emotion. That's just the reality. We can manipulate things all you want. Lights manipulate. Video manipulates. All of those things change mood, emotion, value. Now, it doesn't mean the churches should gather in stone buildings and, cinder block and, echoey sounds and be awful. It doesn't mean you have to do that. The reality is you have to be careful about what we are trying to imitate. The living Christ brings radical transformation to those who encounter him. Now, we have since added music to Easter Sunday. There wasn't any then. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't like when Mary came to the tomb, it was like, dun, 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 dun. Where's Jesus? I don't know. And the people are running around. No. It was just, he's gone. What's going on with that? And then he's there. Emotion, right? Because real life transformative value comes with understanding and meeting Jesus. So, speaking of the most dreadful heathen, Paul talks about his encounter with Christ like this. In the next verse, he says, for I am the least of the apostles, and do not deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them. Not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it is I or they, talking about the apostles, this is what we preach, and this is what you believe. After Paul talks about the fact that he was the last in the chain to meet the risen Christ, he was the abnormally born, run through litter, right? It is the assessment that Paul offers his humble credentials as a reminder of the church at Corinth. Paul proclaims proudly that he is the least of the apostles. I am the least of the apostles. because he was guilty of persecuting the church. Lest we not forget that he was present at the death of Stephen. Right? He was there. Let's not forget that he was present at the death of Stephen, and he was on his way to Damascus to do what? To persecute more Christians, to round them up. He was a zealot for the law and a soldier of the religious establishment. A good soldier always understands the mind of his enemy. He seeks to understand his tactics, his motivations. He spends time understanding them because that increases his ability to have success in battle. If you're going to go deer hunting, for example, it's probably best not to hunt them downtown. Right? They don't hang out there. You have to understand where they are, how they act, if you're going to go get what it is you're seeking to get. The time spent understanding them increases that success. So, of course, Paul understood this little sect called Christianity. He had heard the stories of Jesus, the great leader, right? He had heard stories about the great teacher. He'd heard undoubtedly many of his teachings, right? You don't think the teachings of Jesus got to Paul? I guarantee he'd heard the teachings. He'd heard the teachings. The proclamation, I'm sure the words of the miracles had come across Paul's desk, right? And I'm sure the rumor of his resurrection had made its way around the Pharisee dinner tables, right? You don't think this event was quietly going on in the backwoods, behind closed doors? Of course it wasn't. The Pharisees knew what was going on. That information was getting around quick, right? Rumor mills are fast. Rumor mills are quick. I guarantee somebody gets out of the grave. It doesn't take long, right? I mean, I've had things I know about me that I think are innocuous and dull and lame, and those rumors go really fast. Man, if I rise from the dead, it should be quick. It should be amazing. So I guarantee it crossed a few dinner tables. Paul was a student of the Hebrew Scriptures. He understood the prophecies and the messianic predictions, right? As well as anyone who ever walked the face of the earth. He understood those predictions and those prophecies. And Jesus fit them perfectly, yet Paul persecuted. How is it someone could have known the prophecies so well, known the stories so well, and faced so much empirical data and still not believe? Do you really think that Paul didn't interview the occasional healed leper? Do you think that everybody healed by Jesus ran off into the woods to hide? They went what? They went walking and leaping and praising God on occasion, right? They did. So you think Paul didn't actually talk to some guy who's like, dude, I was a leper on Saturday? You don't think that conversation happened one time? No, it did, right? Paul ran across a few healed people. Dude who didn't have a leg on Thursday is now running in marathons on Saturday. Witnesses abound everywhere. And Paul's going, well, somehow still doesn't believe. Well, how is it that Paul could know all of that? Paul was not just some dude who was living across, the lake. He was someone who knew the Hebrew Scriptures, who knew the prophecies, who knew the data, who knew the predictions, who knew everything and yet still did not believe. And so a lot of times when people are like, well, I'm going to go seek the truth out for myself. It's like, well, but it's going to take something else too. Because Paul still didn't. And so what happened was simple, really. An encounter with the living Christ was the one thing missing from his life. It was the one thing just not there. The dead Jesus and his teachings meant nothing. They meant nothing to Paul. And when he met the risen and living Jesus, he encountered a grace that he had never experienced before. Because as a student of law and judgment, there was no reason for the living Christ to delay the termination of Paul's life any longer that day on the road to Damascus. Right? Paul knew the angry and just God from the Old Testament, as well as anyone, and he knew how he would deal with those who persecuted him. Better than anyone. The Old Testament was the measuring stick for Paul's life. He did not, deserve another chance or even a smidgen of grace, but he was given exactly that by Jesus that day. Paul was on his way to continue in the persecution when something crazy happened. Jesus got in his way and stopped him in his tracks and changed his life forever. Jesus explained to Paul the fact that you are persecuting me. Remember? Paul, why are you persecuting Me, right? And Paul asks the very important next question. Who are you? Right? That's always a good question to ask, by the way. If you were ever blinded by a beacon of light, accusing you of doing something bad, ask who it is. Right? I'm Jesus. So Paul was, in all of his zealousness, persecuting God. Peter is often ridiculed for his denial, right? We ridicule him for that. What a coward. Couldn't even be honest about Jesus to a woman by a fire. But Paul was guilty of something far more severe. A man who spent his life protecting religion had in fact been persecuting the entire time the object of his worship. Paul says that he's not worthy to even be called an apostle. But by grace, he says, I am what I am. In other words, because of grace, this horrid God persecutor was given another try. Was given another chance. And he says that grace was not without effect, for it drove me to work harder than anybody else. There's that weird connection that people like to make between grace and works, right? Grace so changed my life, it drove me to work harder than anyone else because he had a lot of time to make up for. Imagine your own personal life if you're walking into the bathroom one morning, all of a sudden, boom, you're blinded, you're standing there on your knee going, what in the world? And Jesus goes, why are you persecuting me? You don't think that's going to change the rest of your life to get up off your hiney and do something? Because you're looking back going, my whole life's been persecution. I really probably need to make some changes. And I got some time to make up for it. Well, that's really what happened, is Paul was driven to a life of duty to Christ. That grace made him aware of what he owed him. Yet all of us are the same boat, really, because we're enemies with Christ, but very few of us feel that Pauline measure of loyalty to God and for his grace toward us. And so Paul finishes all of this with a simple little sentence that he says, this is what we preach, and this is what you believed. We preach the resurrected Christ. We put this truth at the center of all we taught you because we do not want you to forget about that. For you were saved by the resurrection, or without it, I would not have come to you, is what Paul's saying. Without my encounter with the living Christ, you would not have heard the message of grace, is what he's telling the church at Corinth. Because really, it was the grace in my life that brought to your lives the unknown grace in your life too. Because had Paul not been stopped at that day, the church at Corinth would never have gotten that information from him. It was his encounter with the living Christ that changed those around him. So while we are busy debating and creating chaos in our public worship services, let us not forget what Jesus did for us. This is what we preached, and this is what you believed. And sometimes I think in our own lives we need to make sure and take a step back and remember that and focus on that. It's often when the difficulties of church, politics, and doing those things gets a hold of us, wears us down. We just need to step back and remember that we're saved with the message of Jesus and his resurrection. And thus we're saved to it as well. And the living Christ has been known to change an itinerary or two in the past. The living Christ has stopped many of us, I think, in this room on the road to someplace we shouldn't have been going. Maybe we weren't on the road to persecute the church, per se, but we might have been on the road to self-destruction or self-destructiveness. And just before we'd gone too far, we found Jesus. We're called out from the pit of despair and confusion in that moment. I can recall in my own life that walk and that time when I was called back from it. And so it's easy for me, like Paul, to kind of stand up here and say that I'm the least of all of them as well. I don't elevate myself above anything. I'm the least, as much as he is the least. I'm the least. But that doesn't change any of the desire and the boldness to proclaim to all of you that the gospel is consistent and that what I teach is consistent with what the apostles taught. So that this is what you was preached and this is what you believe. And that's why we do these things. We talk about these values of resurrection because it is what we preach. So it is what you believe. So it is what you are saved to is the truth, as opposed to being saved to all this other stuff. Because all that other stuff's going to leave you someday. All that other stuff's going to pass away. The only thing that stays is Jesus. The only thing that stays with us is that. So the resurrection of Christ has to have a special hold on the heart of the believer. It has to have a place. Because if we don't hold tight to it, we proclaim that death has power over God. Right? And if we proclaim that death has power over God, then what's the point of worshiping God? There is no point. If you believe that he did not overcome death, and that he did not have an earthly resurrection, there's no reason to worship. And we're going to talk a lot about that next week, so for those of you who want to read ahead, you'll find out why. Because Paul really brings that one into focus. But that's just the truth. And so next week we're going to talk a lot about that. Today, I just wanted to remind all of you that to what was preached is what you were saved. And I hope that all of you have had that moment, that encounter with the risen Christ, with the living Christ, and that you're not living based on, something that's untrue, something that's impartial, something that's not perfect. And that like that creed, it really is that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again. And like Peter, what's great about that video is it brings it really into focus. Peter's life was changed because of the resurrection. I have a relationship with the living Christ, not the dead one. I understand his teachings because I have a relationship with him, not the other way around. So, let's close in prayer. Father God, we just thank you for this morning, and God, I hold so true to that final statement. This is what we preach, and that's what you believe. And God, I just pray, I just hope that everybody in this room is at that point where they believe the heart of what is being taught. They're not caught up in the other stuff. As fun as that stuff is to talk about, I just pray that their salvation is not caught up in it. That they can step back and say, this is what was preached and this is what I believe. This is what was taught. I was saved to the resurrection of Jesus. I was saved to grace. I was not saved to a good atmosphere, or a great time, or good music, or good friends. Nothing wrong with any of those things, but I was not saved to that. If that goes away tomorrow, I'm not going to be hurting because I was saved to grace. I was saved to the resurrection. And God, I just pray that really is the heart of everybody here. The more I studied, the more I read this week, I just pray that's the heart of everybody. And right where they're at is that I was saved to what matters. And that I'm not getting caught up in the other stuff. So, God, I just pray for the challenge Richard gave during the offering. I pray your blessing over our motivations. Like Paul says, because of grace, I work harder than everybody else. Because of grace, I didn't sit on my hands. Because of grace, I didn't think, oh, great, fantastic. But no, I went straight to work. And God, I just pray we all feel challenged, myself included, with that challenge that he put out this morning. God, go with us this week. Give us many opportunities for ministry. And thank you so much in your tremendous name. Amen. All right, you guys are dismissed. Absolutely. Hey, doing whatever it is y'all do.